The professor said my analysis of the novel was completely wrong. I wrote the book. No way! I was sitting in the back row of Professor Whitmore's contemporary literature seminar at Riverside University, trying to stay invisible. The classroom smelled like old coffee and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, while 20 students flipped through copies of The Drowning Season, my novel that had won the National Book Award 3 years ago. That's a big deal, and he doesn't know who he's messing with. Lol. I'd enrolled in this graduate program under my legal first and middle name, Diana Ashford, instead of my pen name, D.A. Mitchell. Nobody had connected the dots yet. I needed this. After the book tour madness and the constant public dissection of my work, I just wanted to be a student again, to hear what people really thought when they didn't know I was listening. That is actually brilliant. So smart, but oh man, it's about to backfire. Professor Whitmore was considered one of the leading experts on contemporary American fiction, and I was genuinely curious about his interpretation of my work. That curiosity was about to cost me everything. Uh-oh, cue the dramatic music. Professor Whitmore stood at the front of the class, holding up his marked copy of my book like it was evidence in a trial. What Mitchell fails to understand about her own protagonist is that Eleanor's drowning obsession isn't about trauma. It's about feminine hysteria. Excuse me? Did he just say that? What year is it? He said this with such confidence, such absolute certainty, that several students nodded and started taking notes. Oh, sheep. Don't listen to him. My pen froze on my notebook. I'd spent 2 years writing Eleanor's character, basing her fear of water on my own near-drowning experience at age 12. Every single scene was deliberately crafted to show how trauma reshapes your relationship with the world. He is so wrong. That would make my blood boil. Whitmore continued pacing, now getting into his rhythm. The author clearly intended this as a metaphor for female weakness, the inability to overcome irrational fears. It's almost Freudian in its simplicity. Freudian in its simplicity? Get over yourself, dude. Oh wait, I can't do eye roll. Ha ha. Let's try. A girl in the front row raised her hand and suggested that maybe the water symbolized Eleanor's attempt to reclaim her power. Whitmore laughed, actually laughed, and said, "That's a very undergraduate reading, Melissa. We're past surface-level interpretations here." Wow, what a jerk. He's totally dismissing a good idea. I raised my hand slowly, my heart pounding so hard I thought everyone could hear it. Deep breaths, Diana. Go get him. Whitmore glanced at me with mild interest, probably wondering why the quiet student in the back was suddenly participating. Yes, Diana. I cleared my throat and kept my voice steady. What if the drowning obsession is actually about PTSD? The text specifically mentions Eleanor's childhood incident in Chapter 4, and throughout the book, her reactions align with trauma responses rather than hysteria. You tell him what's up. Whitmore's expression shifted from interest to condescension in about 2 seconds. He set the book down on his desk and crossed his arms. I appreciate your enthusiasm, but you're conflating the character's backstory with the author's thematic intent. Mitchell herself has said in interviews that the book is about the human condition, not some personal trauma diary. Wait, he's quoting her? But he has no idea he's talking to her. This is too good. He was quoting an interview I'd given to a magazine that had completely twisted my words. I'd actually said the book explores how personal trauma is part of the human condition, but they'd edited it to sound more pretentious and vague. Classic media mess-up. Always gotta ruin the nuance. But what if the interview was misrepresented? I pushed back, trying to keep my tone academic and neutral. If you look at the structure of the narrative, every water scene is triggered by specific sensory details that mirror trauma flashbacks. That's not hysteria, that's clinically accurate PTSD representation. Yes, stay calm and stick to the facts. Whitmore actually rolled his eyes. Rude! He walked closer to my desk and I could see other students shifting uncomfortably. Diana, I've been teaching this novel for 2 years. I've published 3 papers on Mitchell's work. I've interviewed her twice for academic journals. I think I understand her intentions better than a first-semester graduate student who's reading the book for the first time. He is so full of himself, I can't even. The classroom went dead silent. My face felt hot and I knew I should just drop it, but something in me snapped. What if you're wrong about what the author intended? There it is, the fight is on. Whitmore's jaw tightened. I'm not wrong. Mitchell is a talented writer, but like many young female authors, she doesn't fully grasp the literary traditions she's working within. That's not an insult, it's an observation. The text speaks for itself, regardless of what the author thinks she meant. Oh, the arrogance. The text speaks for itself line is just a cop-out when they realize they're losing the argument. The girl next to me, Priya, leaned over and whispered, "Just let it go. He's like this with everyone." But I couldn't let it go. This man was teaching my book wrong, was telling students that my carefully crafted representation of trauma was actually about female weakness and hysteria. He was literally using my work to reinforce the exact stereotypes I'd been fighting against. I feel you, girl. You can't let him get away with it. Whitmore moved back to the front of the class and pulled up a slide on the projector. Let's look at Chapter 12, where Eleanor refuses to get in the boat. Mitchell writes this scene with such melodrama, such excessive emotional reaction that it borders on parody. A stronger writer would have shown restraint, would have trusted the reader to understand the symbolism without all this hand-wringing. Parody? He has no idea how much work that was. He read a passage aloud in a mocking tone that made my chest tight with anger. Okay, now he's just being an awful human being. That chapter had taken me 6 months to write. I'd rewritten it 43 times, trying to capture the exact feeling of panic, the way your body refuses to cooperate when you're triggered, the shame of knowing you're being irrational but being unable to stop it. Wow, that makes it so much worse. All that effort and he calls it melodrama? After class, I sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes, hands shaking on the steering wheel. I pulled out my phone and called my agent, Beth, who answered on the second ring. "Diana, how's the graduate school experience?" Her voice was bright and warm, completely unaware of the storm I was about to unleash. I told her everything, my words tumbling over each other about Whitmore's interpretation and his condescension, and how he was teaching my book as an example of female hysteria. Gotta tell Beth, she needs to know this mess. Beth was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "Diana, honey, this is why I told you going back to school under a different name was a bad idea. You can't control how people interpret your work, even when they're wrong. That's true, but man, it still hurts like crazy when it's that wrong." I knew she was right, but it didn't make it hurt less. She suggested I either reveal my identity or transfer to a different class, but both options felt like giving up. I'd paid for this semester. Don't give up, Diana. You should just stand up next class and say, "Hi, I'm D.A. Mitchell." That would be epic. This is exactly the problem with contemporary literary criticism. Students think they can cherry-pick quotes and force a reading that suits their political agenda, rather than engaging with what the author actually wrote. Oh, here he goes again with the high and mighty talk. He's talking about her work. He turned to the rest of the class like he was performing for them. Mitchell's novel is clearly working within a tradition of feminine Gothic literature, where women's fears are metaphors for larger societal anxieties. To reduce it to a simple trauma narrative is to miss the entire point of the work.
He's missing the point. It's like arguing with a wall. I felt my hands curling into fists at my sides. But what if the author has explicitly stated that the book is based on her own trauma? My voice came out sharper than I intended. Whitmore's eyes narrowed. Authors are notoriously unreliable narrators of their own work. Death of the author, Diana. I'm surprised you haven't encountered that concept yet in your studies. The death of the author card. He plays it like a trump card, but she literally just provided the counter evidence. He turned back to the class and continued talking like I wasn't even there anymore, dismantling my analysis piece by piece while my group mates stared at their shoes. That is so disrespectful. He's such a bully. After class, Priya pulled me aside in the hallway. That took guts, but you know he's going to tank our grade now, right? Poor Priya. She's stuck in the crossfire. She wasn't angry, just resigned, like this was an inevitable consequence of challenging Whitmore's authority. Austin walked past us without making eye contact, clearly annoyed that our presentation had turned into a confrontation. Of course Austin is annoyed. Couldn't even lift a finger. Kayla stopped to say, "I warned you, Diana. Now we're all gonna suffer for it." Seriously, Kayla? Maybe if you had stood up to him, it wouldn't have been so bad. She wasn't entirely wrong. 2 days later, our group grade was posted online. C-. Are you kidding me? A C? He did that out of spite. The comment said, "Our presentation showed promise, but ultimately failed to engage with the text on a sophisticated level, instead relying on reductive psychological readings that missed the literary complexity of Mitchell's work." Reductive psychological readings? I call that the truth. That man is impossible. I stared at that grade on my laptop screen, feeling a mix of anger and vindication. The anger won out. I opened a new document and started typing an email to Professor Whitmore, requesting a meeting during his office hours. Here we go. Time for the final boss battle. If he wanted to discuss sophisticated textual analysis, I'd give him more than he bargained for. Whitmore's office was exactly what you'd expect. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a massive wooden desk covered in papers, and a window overlooking the campus quad. He gestured for me to sit in the small chair across from his desk, positioning himself in the larger leather chair that made him look like he was presiding over a trial. Power move right there. Don't fall for it, Diana. Diana, I appreciate your passion for the material, but your presentation revealed some fundamental misunderstandings about literary analysis. He pulled out a printed copy of my slides with red ink covering every page. All that red ink, that's just cruel. You're confusing biographical criticism with textual analysis. Just because an author experienced trauma doesn't mean every book they write is about that trauma. I let him talk, watching him circle and underline and add sarcastic comments in the margins of my carefully researched work. Just wait until you drop the bomb. When he finally paused, I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder. What if I could show you the author's original notes, her research materials, character sketches, explicit statements about her intentions? Whitmore leaned back in his chair with a patronizing smile. Ugh, that smug smile. I hate it. Diana, even if you had those materials, they wouldn't change the fundamental analysis. The text exists independently of the author's intentions. I opened the folder and spread the documents across his desk. Character sketches for Elmore with notes about PTSD symptoms, research papers on trauma and memory that I'd consulted while writing, excerpts from my own journal about my near-drowning experience that directly paralleled scenes in the book. Whitmore glanced at the papers with vague interest, like I was showing him a student's creative project. These are fascinating fabrications, Diana, but surely you understand that I can't take anonymous documents at face value. Anyone could type up fake author notes. Fabrications? Okay, that's crossing a line. Time to end this. His dismissiveness was so absolute, so unshakable, that I felt something shift inside me. I pulled up my phone and opened my email, scrolling to messages from my publisher, from Beth, from early readers who'd seen the manuscript. I turned the phone toward him, showing him an email chain about Eleanor's character development that was dated 2 years before the book's publication. Whitmore squinted at the screen, and then pushed the phone back toward me. Email addresses can be spoofed. I'm not sure what you're trying to accomplish here.
But making up evidence isn't going to change your grade. He really thinks she's just making all this up for a C? The audacity! I stood up from the chair, my legs shaky, but my voice steady. I'm not making anything up, Professor Whitmore. I'm Dia Mitchell. I wrote The Drowning Season, and you've been teaching it wrong for 2 years. Holy cow! She said it! I can't believe she finally did it. The words hung in the air between us, and for the first time since I'd entered his office, Whitmore looked uncertain.
He glanced at the documents on his desk, then back at my face, then at my phone screen. That's quite a claim. His voice had lost some of its confidence. Oh, he is panicking now. Dia Mitchell is a pseudonym, obviously, but her real name is... He trailed off, pulling out his phone and presumably Googling me. I watched the realization hit him in stages. First confusion, then recognition, then something that looked almost like panic. His face went pale as he scrolled through images, comparing my face to book jacket photos where I'd worn heavier makeup and styled hair.
He's definitely Googling D.A. Mitchell right now. Busted. But you enrolled as Diana Ashford. You never said... He was stammering now, his perfect professor persona crumbling. Why would you hide your identity? This is highly irregular. I gathered my documents from his desk, sliding them back into my folder with deliberate slowness. Take your time, enjoy the moment. Diana Ashford Mitchell, the name I've been hiding all semester, right there in black and white. Whitmore picked up the ID card with shaking hands, studying it like it might be a forgery. He compared the photo to my face multiple times, and I could see him mentally reviewing every comment he'd made about my work, every condescending explanation, every dismissal of my undergraduate readings. He's replaying the whole semester. That must feel awful for him, but he deserves it. I didn't know, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. You should have told me. Why? I asked, surprised by how calm my voice sounded when everything inside me was screaming. So you could treat my interpretation as valid only because of who I am, rather than because of the textual evidence? The analysis I presented was solid, regardless of my identity. Boom. That's the core issue right there. What a line. Whitmore sank back into his chair, and I could see him trying to recalibrate, trying to find some way to maintain his authority in the situation. Be that as it may, the principle of death of the author still stands. Your intentions, while interesting, don't override the text itself or how readers and scholars interpret it. He is seriously clinging to that one principle. He just can't admit he's wrong. I almost laughed at his audacity. Even now, confronted with proof that he'd been wrong, he was doubling down. Professor Whitmore, you didn't just interpret my book differently. You taught it as something it fundamentally isn't. You told students that Eleanor's trauma was hysteria, that her recovery arc was weakness. You used my work to reinforce harmful stereotypes about women and mental health. Hit him where it hurts.
That's the real issue here. He flinched at that, but didn't back down. That's your subjective reading of my teaching. Literary criticism involves multiple perspectives. I leaned forward, placing both hands on his desk. It's not subjective when you're factually wrong about what happens in the text. Eleanor doesn't give in to hysteria in Chapter 12. She has a panic attack triggered by specific sensory details I carefully planted throughout the earlier chapters. That's not interpretation, that's reading comprehension. Oof, reading comprehension, that's the ultimate burn for a professor. Whitmore's face flushed red, anger replacing his earlier shock. I don't appreciate your tone, Miss Mitchell. Regardless of your identity, you're still a student in my class, and you will show me the respect that position demands. I straightened up, slinging my bag over my shoulder. I'll show you the same respect you showed my work and my analysis. I'm filing a formal complaint with the department chair about your teaching methods and your grading bias. That C- our group received was retaliation for challenging your interpretation, and we both know it. Yes, formal complaint time. Whitmore stood up abruptly, his chair rolling back and hitting the bookshelf behind him. You're making a serious accusation. Do you have any proof of bias? I pulled out my phone again and opened my recording app. As a matter of fact, I do. I've been recording every class session since week 3. She's got receipts. The plot thickens. The color drained from Whitmore's face as I played back snippets of his lectures, his voice clearly stating that Mitchell doesn't understand her own protagonist and that the book exemplifies female weakness. I'd captured every condescending comment, every dismissal of alternative interpretations, every gendered assumption about my work. When I stopped the recording, the office was dead silent, except for the ticking of an old clock on his shelf. You can't record classes without permission. There are privacy laws. His voice was desperate now, grasping at straws. I smiled without warmth. Actually, this is a one-party consent state. I'm legally allowed to record any conversation I'm part of. Boom! She did her homework. I knew she was smart. These recordings will be included in my formal complaint, along with documentation of how you graded my group's presentation compared to others. Whitmore sat back down slowly, and I watched him do the math on how bad this could be for him. A published author in his class, recordings of him misrepresenting her work, evidence of retaliatory grading, his academic reputation was about to take a serious hit. Oh man, his career is flashing before his eyes. What do you want? He asked finally, his professorial authority completely gone. He looked small sitting there, just a man who'd been caught being wrong and doubling down instead of admitting it. I considered the question carefully. I want you to correct your teaching. I want you to apologize to the class for misrepresenting the book. I want our group's grade reviewed by an impartial faculty member. And I want you to understand that death of the author doesn't mean you get to make up whatever interpretation you want and call it scholarship. His jaw clenched, but he nodded slowly. I'll need time to review my materials, to reconsider my interpretation in light of this new information. The grudging way he said it told me he still didn't think he was wrong, just that he'd been caught. Classic. He still thinks he's right, he just knows he can't win. I left his office and walked straight to the department chair suite on the 3rd floor. Dr. Patricia Okonkwo was in her office, eating a salad at her desk while reviewing what looked like budget reports. She looked up when I knocked, her expression shifting to concern when she saw my face. Miss Ashford, is everything all right? I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. It's actually Mitchell, Diana Ashford Mitchell, and I need to file a formal complaint against Professor Whitmore. Here we go again. Double shock. I spent the next hour telling her everything.
showing her my ID, playing the recordings, explaining how Whitmore had been teaching my book for 2 years with an interpretation that fundamentally misrepresented my work. Dr. Okonkwo listened carefully, taking notes on a legal pad, her expression growing more serious with each new detail. She sounds like she's taking it seriously, which is good. When I finished, she sat down her pen and looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and frustration.
Why didn't you disclose your identity when you enrolled? This whole situation could have been avoided. I'd been expecting that question, but it still stung. With respect, Dr. Okonkwo, I shouldn't have to announce my credentials to receive fair treatment in a graduate program. My analysis of the text was solid regardless of who I am. The problem isn't that I hate my identity. The problem is that Professor Whitmore dismissed valid textual analysis because it came from a student he didn't respect. Dr. Okonkwo nodded slowly, conceding the point. You're right, of course, but you understand this puts the department in a difficult position. Professor Whitmore is tenured, well-published, and highly regarded in the field. These accusations... here comes the political drama. Tenure is such a pain. She trailed off, and I could see her already calculating the political fallout. I pulled out my phone and played her another recording, this one from the class where Whitmore had mocked a student's interpretation as very undergraduate and laughed at someone else's suggestion that Eleanor was reclaiming her power. He's not just wrong about my book, he's creating a hostile learning environment for any student who dares to disagree with him. How many other students has he dismissed like this? How many valid interpretations has he shut down because they didn't match his framework? Turning the focus from her problem to the systemic problem, smart. Dr. Okonkwo's expression hardened as she listened. I'll need to keep these recordings for the investigation, and I'll need you to write a formal statement detailing everything that happened with dates and specific incidents. She pulled out a form and slid it across her desk. I want you to know that I take these allegations seriously. Academic freedom is important, but so is academic integrity. If Professor Whitmore has been misrepresenting source material and retaliating against students who challenge him, that's a serious problem. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. However, I need to warn you that filing this complaint will likely become public knowledge. Your identity as D.A. Mitchell will be revealed to the entire department, possibly to the media if this gets big enough. Are you prepared for that? I thought about it for a long moment, weighing my desire for privacy against my responsibility to other students who might be suffering under Whitmore's teaching. I'm prepared. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about making sure he can't do this to anyone else. Yes, taking one for the team, that's the right attitude. That evening, I sat in my apartment drafting the formal complaint. My cat, Gatsby, purring on my lap while I typed. Good kitty support. The document grew to 12 pages as I detailed every incident, every recording, every piece of evidence that Whitmore had been teaching my book in bad faith. My phone kept buzzing with texts from Priya, who'd somehow heard through the department gossip network that something big was going down. Is it true you're D.A. Mitchell? The whole program is freaking out. I sent back a simple yes and turned off my phone, needing silence to finish this. Haha, I bet the tea is scalding in that department right now. At midnight, I finally submitted the complaint through the university's official portal, attached all my documentation, and sat back feeling simultaneously relieved and terrified. There was no taking it back now. I'd lit a match and thrown it into Whitmore's carefully constructed academic reputation. Whatever happened next would change everything. But at least I'd done something. At least I'd stood up for my work and for every student who'd been dismissed and belittled in that classroom. That feeling of relief must have been immense. The next morning, my phone exploded with notifications. Someone had leaked the story to the campus newspaper, and by noon, it had spread to literary Twitter. National Book Award winner secretly enrolled in grad program. Professor taught her book wrong for 2 years, was trending. Oh my God, it went viral. I knew it would. Beth called me 7 times before I finally answered, and when I did, she was laughing so hard she could barely speak. Diana, this is insane. This is the best book publicity money can't buy. Do you know how many people are buying The Drowning Season right now just to see what the fuss is about? I hadn't thought about the publicity angle, had been too focused on the principle of the thing, but Beth was right. My book sales had jumped 30% in a single day. Cha-ching! Take that, Professor Whitmore. Publishers Weekly wanted an exclusive interview. NPR wanted me on their morning show. Everyone wanted to hear about the author who'd gone undercover and caught a professor teaching her book wrong. The story had everything: academic drama, gender politics, a David versus Goliath narrative that people couldn't resist. Professor Whitmore sent me an email at 3 a.m. that was clearly written in a panic. Miss Mitchell, I think we can resolve this situation amicably without involving the media. Perhaps we could discuss revising your grade and issuing a private apology to your group. There's no need for this to become a public spectacle that damages both our reputations. Amicably? He wants to sweep it under the rug, and framing it as both their reputations being damaged is classic deflection. I read it twice, noting how he'd framed it as damage to both our reputations, when really this was only hurting him. I forwarded the email to Dr. Okonkwo without responding, letting it serve as more evidence of his attempt to minimize the situation. An hour later, the university released an official statement saying they were investigating the matter and that Professor Whitmore had been placed on administrative leave pending the review. Yes, the university acted fast. That's a good sign. The English department's phone lines were apparently jammed with calls from current students, former students, and journalists, all wanting to know more. Several other students came forward with their own stories of Whitmore shutting down their interpretations and retaliating with bad grades. The investigation was growing beyond just my complaint into a larger examination of his teaching methods and grading practices. It's not just about her anymore. It's about justice for everyone he dismissed. I gave my first interview to NPR 3 days later, sitting in their local studio with headphones on while the host asked me about death of the author theory and whether writers should have final say over their work's interpretation. I tried to explain that this wasn't really about author intent versus reader interpretation. It was about a professor teaching factually incorrect information and creating a hostile environment for students. If Professor Whitmore had simply offered a different interpretation, that would be fine. Disagreement is part of literary criticism. But he taught my trauma narrative as hysteria, mocked students who saw the PTSD themes, and graded us down for presenting textual evidence that contradicted his view. That's not interpretation, that's ideological bias masquerading as scholarship. Nailed it. That's the perfect summary of the whole mess. The interview aired during morning drive time and apparently caused heated debates in English departments across the country. Some professors defended Whitmore's right to interpret text however he wanted. Others argued that basic reading comprehension should come before theoretical interpretation. The literary world was divided, and I was at the center of it, whether I wanted to be or not. A week into the investigation, Dr. Okonkwo called me into her office again. She looked exhausted with dark circles under her eyes and an empty coffee cup forest on her desk. The review committee has finished their preliminary findings. I wanted to tell you personally before it goes public. She handed me a folder thick with documents, interview transcripts from other students, reviews of Whitmore's grading patterns, analysis of his published papers on my work. We found evidence of systematic bias in his teaching and grading. Multiple students reported being penalized for interpretations that differed from his framework. His published papers on your novel contain several factual errors about the text itself, suggesting he was prioritizing his theoretical lens over actual close reading. She paused, looking uncomfortable. He's being formally reprimanded and will be required to undergo training on inclusive teaching practices. His courses will be monitored next semester, but he's not being fired. Tenure is the worst. That is so disappointing. I felt my stomach drop. That's it? After everything, he just gets a slap on the wrist and has to take a workshop? Dr. Okonkwo sighed heavily. Tenure is a powerful protection, Miss Mitchell. The university has limited options for discipline short of termination, and the evidence, while concerning, doesn't rise to that level. However, she pulled out another document. Your group's grade has been changed to an A. Professor Whitmore has been required to issue a formal apology to your group and to revise his course materials on your novel, and he's been removed from teaching graduate seminars for the next year. Okay, that's not nothing. An A, an apology, no more grad students for a year? That's a decent win, even if he didn't get fired. It wasn't enough. Not really, but it was something. More than I'd expected when I first walked into that classroom and heard him call my protagonist hysterical. Dr. Okonkwo leaned forward, her expression sincere. I want you to know that your complaint has already changed our department. We're implementing new policies for student feedback, creating anonymous channels for reporting concerning teaching practices, and reviewing our curriculum to ensure we're teaching diverse perspectives. What you did took courage, and it's making a real difference. Wow, that is actually huge. It's great to hear something positive came out of all that drama. I wanted to feel vindicated, but mostly I just felt tired. Totally get it. Fighting the system is exhausting. The semester ended with a strange mix of triumph and exhaustion. I passed all my other classes with solid grades, but the Whitmore situation had overshadowed everything else. Students I'd never spoken to would stop me on campus to share their own stories of bad professors or to debate death of the author theory. Some treated me like a hero, others like I'd betrayed some unwritten academic code by going public. She became a campus legend. That's intense. The English department threw a small reception for me, awkwardly acknowledging my presence while trying not to make it seem like they were celebrating the takedown of one of their own faculty members. I can only imagine how awkward that party was. Whitmore himself was notably absent, still on administrative leave, and apparently consulting with lawyers about his options. Beth called with news that a literary magazine wanted to publish an essay version of What Happened, offering me $15,000 and a cover feature. Score! Turn the drama into cash. Smart move, Beth. I spent a week writing and revising, trying to capture not just the drama, but the larger issues about how we teach literature, how we value interpretation, and who gets taken seriously in academic spaces. The essay published in the spring and sparked another round of national conversation. This time, though, I felt more in control of the narrative. I wasn't just the author who got wronged. I was making an argument about the state of literary education, about the difference between interpretation and misrepresentation, about creating space for students to challenge authority without fear of retaliation. Exactly. She took back the narrative and made a powerful statement. Universities started reaching out, asking me to speak about author intent and teaching methodology. I gave talks at 6 different schools that semester, each time finding myself in front of rooms full of literature students and professors, all debating what had become known as the Mitchell case. The Mitchell case. That's wild. Some defended Whitmore, arguing I was trying to control how my work was read. Others saw it as I did. Not about control, but about basic textual accuracy and academic integrity. The conversations were messy and uncomfortable, and exactly what literature departments needed to be having. In April, I received an unexpected email from Professor Whitmore. Dear Miss Mitchell, I hope this message finds you well. I've spent these months reviewing my teaching materials, and I must admit, reevaluating my approach to your novel. While I still maintain that Death of the Author is a valid critical framework, I can acknowledge that I allowed my theoretical commitments to override careful reading of the text itself. You were correct that Eleanor's trauma is clearly established and developed throughout the narrative. I was wrong to dismiss your analysis, and I was especially wrong to grade your group's presentation as I did.
Wait, an admission? No way.
This is not easy for me to admit as someone who has built a career on confidence in my interpretations, but scholarship requires intellectual honesty even when that honesty is uncomfortable. The email continued for 3 more paragraphs, not quite an apology, but closer than I'd expected. He asked if I'd be willing to meet for coffee to discuss the book properly, as colleagues, rather than as professor and student. As colleagues. I stared at the email for a long time, my cursor hovering over the reply button. I met Whitmore at a cafe off campus on a sunny Saturday morning. He looked different without the armor of his professor persona. Older, more uncertain, wearing a cardigan instead of his usual blazer. We ordered coffee and sat across from each other, the awkwardness thick between us. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," he started, stirring sugar into his cup with more focus than necessary. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about my teaching, my assumptions, my ego." He looked up at me then, and I was surprised to see genuine remorse in his expression. "I convinced myself that I understood your work better than you did. That was arrogant and, frankly, lazy scholarship." Wow, a full confession. That takes guts, even after being cornered. I sipped my coffee, waiting to see where this was going. Whitmore continued, "I've been rereading The Drowning Season without my theoretical framework, just letting the text speak for itself. You're right about the trauma narrative. I missed it because I was looking for something more complicated, more literary, when the truth was right there on the page." This is the conversation she deserved all along. We talked for 2 hours, and it was the conversation I'd wanted to have all semester. Whitmore asked questions about my writing process, really listened to my answers, and shared his own evolving thoughts about the book. He admitted that his published papers on my work would need corrections, that he planned to write a follow-up piece acknowledging his misreading. "I want to use this as a teaching moment," he said, "not just for my students, but for other scholars. We get so attached to our interpretations that we stop seeing what's actually there." That's a big lesson for academia. It wasn't a complete redemption arc. He still had work to do repairing his teaching practices and rebuilding trust with students, but it was a start, a genuine attempt to learn from his mistakes rather than just protecting his reputation. When we parted ways, he shook my hand and said, "Your book deserved better than my reading of it. Thank you for holding me accountable, even though I made it incredibly difficult." I walked back to my car feeling something shift. Not quite forgiveness, but maybe understanding. Growth is messy and rarely happens on our preferred timeline. What a surprisingly mature ending to all that madness. The university invited me to give a lecture that fall as part of their Distinguished Speaker Series. I stood in front of a packed auditorium looking out at students and faculty and community members who'd come to hear about what happened. I talked about The Drowning Season, about writing Elenar's journey through trauma and recovery, about the importance of representation and accurate portrayals of mental health in literature. But I also talked about what I'd learned from the experience with Whitmore, about humility, about the difference between interpretation and misrepresentation, about creating educational spaces where disagreement is welcomed, but evidence still matters. Authors don't get to control how readers experience their work, I said. But readers and scholars have a responsibility to engage with what's actually on the page before building their theories. There's a balance between honoring author intent and allowing for multiple interpretations. Finding that balance requires intellectual honesty, careful reading, and willingness to be wrong. That's a brilliant way to sum up the whole debate. The lecture was followed by a Q&A that ran over by 30 minutes. Students asking thoughtful questions about writing, teaching, and navigating difficult situations in academic settings. After the lecture, a young woman approached me nervously, clutching a copy of The Drowning Season. "Miss Mitchell, I just wanted to say thank you. I was in Professor Whitmore's class last year, and I disagreed with his interpretation, but I was too scared to speak up. Seeing what you did made me realize I don't have to accept every authority figure's opinion as fact. Oh, that's so sweet. She really inspired someone. She asked me to sign her book, and while I wrote my name, she told me she was working on her own novel about surviving anxiety disorder. I was worried that writing about mental health would be seen as weak or melodramatic, but your book showed me it could be powerful and literary. We talked for a few minutes about her project, and I gave her my email in case she wanted feedback on her manuscript. As she walked away, I realized this was why the whole situation had mattered. Not just about correcting one professor's interpretation, but about showing other students, other writers, that their experiences and perspectives were valid and worth defending. A truly heartwarming moment. That's the real win. 6 months later, I defended my master's thesis on contemporary trauma narratives in American fiction. The defense went smoothly, with a committee who actually engaged with my arguments rather than dismissing them. Professor Whitmore wasn't on my committee. We'd both agreed that would be inappropriate given our history, but he attended the public portion of the defense and asked a thoughtful question about the intersection of personal experience and literary craft. After I passed, he congratulated me in the hallway and told me he'd revised his entire curriculum based on what he'd learned from our confrontation. "I'm teaching your book again next semester," he said, "but this time I'm leading with the trauma narrative and using it to discuss how we can honor author intent while still exploring multiple interpretations. I'm also bringing in guest speakers who work in trauma psychology to provide context." That's a huge, concrete change. The man actually learned his lesson. It was strange hearing him talk about teaching my book correctly after everything, but it was also satisfying knowing that future students would get a more accurate, more respectful reading of Eleanor's journey. My agent called a week after graduation with news that surprised me. "Diana, your sales have tripled since this all went public. The Drowning season is getting a nude printing with a special edition cover, and your publisher wants to know when the next book is coming." A special edition cover? The scandal was the best marketing ever. I'd been so focused on the academic drama that I'd barely written anything new in months. But sitting down at my desk that evening, looking at a blank document on my screen, I felt words starting to flow for the first time in a long time. This next book would be different, shaped by everything I'd learned about standing up for yourself in your work, about the messy process of creating change, about how sometimes the most important battles are the ones you never expected to fight. I typed the first sentence, then the second, and kept going until I had 5 pages of a new story taking shape. This one would be about a musician who discovers her composition professor has been taking credit for her work, blending themes of artistic ownership, gender dynamics in creative fields, and finding your voice when systems try to silence you. Ooh, I love that plot. It's perfectly inspired by her own experience. The story of what happened with Professor Whitmore still comes up sometimes in interviews and panels. People ask if I regret going public, if I wish I'd handled it differently, if I think I was too harsh or not harsh enough. My answer is always the same. I did what I needed to do to protect my work and other students in that program. Could it have been handled more quietly? Maybe, but quiet conversations behind closed doors don't create systemic change. They don't lead to new policies or revised teaching methods, or professors genuinely reconsidering their approaches. Sometimes you have to make noise to make a difference, even when that noise is uncomfortable and messy and risks your own reputation. Louder for the people in the back. Looking back now, I'm proud of the scared student who raised her hand in that classroom and challenged a tenured professor. I'm proud of the person who kept pushing even when it would have been easier to drop the class and walk away. And I'm proud of the writer who understood that defending your work isn't about ego, it's about integrity. End of story. What a wild ride. If you're still here, you're a true fan. Show some support with a like and subscribe to catch the next episode. See you soon. Carla's out.